Hello everyone, I'm Arif Farudin and welcome to Progressus Asia's channel. Joining us today is Dr. Thomas Wilson, an aqua nutrition consultant who will be talking with us about functional aqua feed. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Wilson.
I'm happy to be here.
Let's start with the definition. What is functional aqua feed?
Obviously, in the name, when we're talking about functional, it's telling us that there's something special about this feed. It's not just a simple, normal formulated feed. Functional feed has a specific purpose. You have a specific need, and then either a feed company provides you, or perhaps you might take a standard feed and you might then coat it with something or add something to it in order to produce your own functional feed. So when we're talking about functional, what are the functions that we're looking for? We might look for a feed which is going to help improve an animal's ability to withstand stress. Like, for example, in Europe, the salmon feed industry uses a lot of functional feeds because they found that they have benefit. When they know they're going to have to move the salmon from freshwater to seawater, this is a high stress period. So they will prepare the fish by starting to feed them a couple of weeks in advance of the time that the fish are going to be moved in order to help them to deal with the issues of stress. Why are we worried about stress? Because if the fish are overstressed, they can become susceptible to disease. They will be stressed, they won't eat. If they don't eat, they don't grow. And then, of course, they can become weaker. Another example from salmon is their preferred water temperature is only 10 degrees Celsius. So when the water temperature goes up to 15, or maybe could be, let's say 18, the salmon are under a lot of stress. So they develop special feeds that help the salmon to deal with high temperatures. Here in Southeast Asia, our fish need help if the temperatures go too low. So, a functional feed can be a winter feed, for example. And if we know something about, the fish that we're growing, we know that their feed intake will go down because it's cooler, they don't eat so much. Are they getting enough nutrition or not? We might want to change the formulation, make the feed more dense nutritionally. Maybe we want to add some ingredients to support the ability to digest better, more efficiently. Maybe like some feed enzymes, or maybe we change the profile of the fats that we add in order to make sure that animals eat less but get the same amount of nutrients. So these are examples of functional feed.
I see. So I'm curious to know how many functions that we can have in one aqua feed.
In the aqua feed industry, nobody is going to try to make something that works for everything. You really do need to have a specific need, and you develop a feed specifically for that purpose. The kinds of things that we, as I mentioned already, dealing with stress. Sometimes we might be worried about cannibalism. We might be worried about reducing aggressive behavior. Certain fish can be very aggressive, like Asian Seabass. So there are things that we can put in the feed to, calm them down and reduce the cannibalism. And it also applies to shrimp too. Shrimp and crabs and other crustaceans is the same thing. If we talk about let's say shrimp or whatever, they're going to be continually under a kind of a stress. So if we were to talk about a formula to deal with stress, my shrimp feed formulas when I was working were actually quite complicated. I had, including premixes, I might have as many as 20 or 22 different ingredients. Why would I do that? Well, you may be well aware that here in Thailand, we have this reputation for growing shrimp at higher stocking densities than anybody else. And so if you were to take a feed that grows shrimp well at low stocking density and bring it over here, it probably would not work very well. So I had to think about that. How do I make a feed that the shrimp can eat and grow and deal with this stress from a high stocking density, for me, a functional feed would be, well, what can I do to make sure that my shrimp stay healthy in the winter? Is there a way that I can prevent them from losing weight? In terms of fish, functional feeds would be, as I've mentioned already, specific times of the year, we know that they're going to be dealing with stress. Some species, we might be doing some moving around in the farm. We might be doing some grading. Things like Asian sea bass, they often have to be graded. Freshwater prawns, if you want large ones, you have to grade them because big ones inhibit the growth of small ones. And anytime you're dealing with these issues like this, and you know by the calendar, by your schedule, when you're going to have to do those things, you can then use a specific feed for a specific purpose in advance to help you to not see, animals getting sick and, staying healthy and continuing to eat and grow.
What if the case is a feed miller selling commercial aqua feed to independent farmers? And then, different farmers, different requests, for the functions, like these farmers want stress, the other one want efficiency. How can this feed miller accommodate the different functions needed, but still, manage the cost of production?
Here in Asia, it's very difficult because, one, the volumes aren't there. Yeah. And so this is why quite often farmers may find it more useful for them to actually, buy a standardized feed and then, put some kind of a premix or some kind of a coating on their own feed. It's very challenging for a feed company to do that. And at the moment, I'm not aware of anybody that would do that if your volume is very low. Now, my company was willing to take a feed additive from a customer and add it to a feed specifically for them, but they had to buy like at least 1 or 2 truckloads. Otherwise, it's not worth the time for the factory to shut down, to prepare some special batches to produce the feed, and then shut down again and clean up and do something else. I mean, it's a very expensive proposition.
So, according to your observation, how is the adoption of functional aqua feed in Asia? Is this a growing trend in Asia?
In general, we have found that the uptake of functional feeds in Asia seems to be quite low. And whether that's because they don't have enough understanding, nobody's been able to convince them that the extra cost is worth. So then quite often you also have to think about, you can provide a functional feed, but then with 100 farmers growing things 100 different ways, how many of those farmers are going to see a positive effect and how many farmers might see no effect at all? And I know that the uptake of simply doing things like feed mills, taking on the use of enzymes for feed enzymes, for example, phytase enzymes or enzymes for helping to digest carbohydrates, if the feed doesn't have the right ingredients, using the enzyme isn't going to work.
True.
And so then we had a very slow uptake in Thailand because people were trying to use these enzymes, and some feed companies saw no impact at all, another feed company did. And we said, well, why should we pay more for something if we can't prove to the customer that it's going to work all the time, every time? And so this is really the challenge. And then you say to the customer, well, yeah, it'll work. And then they find out it doesn't really work, and they say, so why am I paying extra? It's very difficult. And certainly here in Southeast Asia, and Asia in general, people are very sensitive to price. So you can't there's no one size fits all. It can be really challenging. And then one of the things I think that is also very helpful is that it depends a lot on your feed composition. In the past, we would use a lot of fish meal, and we didn't have much vegetable proteins in there. And so one of the things we cover in our training is like what we classify as anti-nutritional factors.
Yeah.
So these are things that come oftentimes with plants ingredients that actually inhibit digestion. They inhibit or they bind to nutrients. Where in the past, when all we used was fish meal, we never really had a problem with any of that. And so as we begin to, reduce fish meal and use these other ingredients, then sometime part of what we need to understand is that things like feed enzymes really can be very cost effective. But no feed company is going to give you those enzymes without making you pay for them.
Yeah, true.
Now, I found the very first time that I started using phytase enzyme, and I was the second user from the company called DSM. Okay, we had several suppliers in those days, but I was the second one, and I was the first customer in Thailand to start using another enzyme called xylanase. Okay, so what did I find with the phytase? As soon as I fed it to catfish that I had left over in my R&D center, I immediately saw a 10% improvement in growth with catfish. It wasn't even an experiment. I just said, I got these fish sitting over here. Let's feed them this fish I made. I don't know whether it was a catfish feed or a tilapia feed. I said, let's just feed them and see what happens. And they grew faster. I said, this really works. But when you start talking about some of the other things like, say, xylanase, with enzymes, it's very important that you have to have the right substrates in the feed. If your feed contains no carbohydrates that the enzyme works with, you'll see zero effect.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the problems that when we start talking about enzymes is, are we using the right enzymes for our feed ingredients? Because if we're not using the right enzymes for our feed ingredients, then the customer probably won't see any benefit at all. And certainly feed with enzymes is probably the one thing that we have had the biggest adoption across Southeast Asia. I would say certainly here in Thailand, all the main suppliers of fish feed now are using enzymes in the feeds. I believe Indonesia, also a lot of the feed companies are using enzymes. Vietnam, many of them are now. And it helps us to use these plant ingredients to make our feeds more sustainable, where we're trying to find ways to reduce our use of fish meal or maybe other, expensive ingredients coming out of the sea.
For the use of feed enzyme, is it becoming, a must to use or still an option to use?
Well, if you look at other feed industries, if you look at the poultry industry,
yeah,
I suspect that there is not any feed companies anywhere in the world today that are not using enzymes.
Yeah.
Because if you can very tiny amount of money per chicken, when you're growing billions of chickens, it adds up to big profit. And it is very cost effective. For aquaculture, the thing is that every feed formula for every different species is slightly different. And once again, we can't have one size fits all. That's really our challenge. I find that enzymes that work good in catfish feed are maybe not the best for tilapia feed. But one thing that I do know, like for example, is that enzymes help us to frequently use lower cost ingredients maybe with a lower protein content, a higher fiber content, and yet feed performance remains the same. And whether we choose to tell the customers we're using the enzymes or we don't tell the customers we're using the enzymes, it doesn't really matter, because in the end, they're going to see the benefit. Enzymes are the one area of functional feeds that definitely are being used elsewhere in Asia. But if we start to talk about other alternatives, if we're dealing with broodstock fish, we need more vitamins than if we're just growing fish in farms. Sometime we might need a functional feed for hatcheries that might have more of certain amino acids, maybe higher digestibility, maybe more vitamins. Maybe we might put in some probiotics to help the young animals to have better digestion and so they can have better absorption. Sometimes these are also areas where we can have functional feeds.
I see. Very interesting. So when you mentioned about the price, the price is higher than the standard feed. What is the range? 20 to 30% higher than standard feed? It could be.
If you're talking about enzymes are basically very low dose. And in the case of my experience in my company, it was one of the factors that we factored into the cost. But the enzymes are a very, very minor part of the cost of the feed. So it was quite easy to absorb those costs for enzymes. But when we start talking about other things, like if we talk about yeast products like beta-glucans, or we start talking about mannan oligosaccharides, or we start talking about other functional feed ingredients, those special ingredients are not cheap. They're quite costly. And if you're paying $8, $9, $10 a kilogram for some ingredient, and you have to put a couple of kilograms into a ton of feed, it can actually raise the cost quite substantially, and the feed company has to pass that on. So there's nothing wrong with passing it on if the customer sees the benefit. But this is the problem. The salmon industry, the farmers have accepted the fact that they're willing to pay more because they see the benefit. But here in Asia, most of the farmers haven't been able to see the benefit. And so they're still very reluctant to use functional feeds in the way that we see them being used elsewhere, like for stress relief or for dealing with certain disease kinds of conditions.
Yeah, so many feed millers here in Asia, they need to prove first, show the evidence, show the benefits, and make sure that the feed they sell, really work. They must assist the farmers.
Yeah, that certainly is true. But quite often, we've had the situation. Many years ago, I was working with a shrimp feed company, and that was a time when we were thinking about using beta-glucans to boost shrimp immunity.
Yeah. And
if we were to say look at 1,000 ponds as a statistic, we could say yes, everything is better. But if we went to any one of those ponds, because there's so many things that vary, temperature varies, rainfall varies, management varies, feeding schedules, feeding management varies. And then we have, what about the quality of the animals coming out of the hatchery? And what about the dissolved oxygen? And so quite often with a lot of these specialty feeds, it's extremely difficult to prove that they really, really, really work.
Yeah.
Because the information is there, but it's very hard to pull it out because of all of the other noise. That's another reason why it sometimes is difficult for us here in Asia to really begin to gain the benefits of these functional feeds. So it's very hard for the feed companies, many of them, especially if they're not big, to be able to actually validate the benefit of these feed additives, because we need to test them ourselves instead of just, taking the word of a supplier that it's going to work, right?
From the brochures.
Right.
Okay. Anything else that you want to add, Dr. Wilson, about functional aquafeed?
I really do believe that functional feeds are something that we should be really using more. It's not so much a matter of just looking at the price, the cost of a feed. The real thing we need to be doing is looking at the cost of all of the feed that we've used, and how does that compare with the cost we made when we harvested our crop. We need to look at the total cost of production, not just say, oh, this feed is too expensive, because quite often a more expensive feed, you get what you pay for. It might not be a big benefit. Quite often you might have better water quality. How do you measure that? How does that impact your final production volume that you sell? It's a very subtle difference, but even just a few percent higher survival can make a big difference, especially when you're considering that there might be a 2 or 3 kilogram animal at the end. 5% increased survival is a big deal, right? Yeah. And so even simple things like, having enough B vitamins, which are, the vitamins that we add for dealing with stress, increasing the amounts that we put in the feed beyond just what's the minimum level that's recommended, can have an impact on stress response, can have an impact on survival. And so sometimes these things are very hard to measure. We really need to understand, though, that the cost benefit from the beginning to the end. We know from our experience that some people say, well, I don't want to use much vitamins, they're quite expensive. But I said, well, what if we do a test and we put more vitamins in and we see a higher survival at the end? The increased profit we made, does that cover the cost of this more expensive feed or not? So we don't look at the cost of the feed, we look at the outcome at the end. And based on that, we judge whether the feed was worth paying for or not. And if we say yes, it was, then that's the thing we should do, rather than just saying no, I don't want to buy it because it's too expensive. Well, the final thing that I would say about functional feeds is that even though there isn't a lot of uptake here in Southeast Asia and across Asia in general, there's been a lot of resistance to it. And so I believe that part of the thing is that the feed companies need to investigate the range of functional feed ingredients that there are, but you simply can't trust the brochure of the company producing them. You actually have to do reliable in-house testing. That sometimes can take time. In our Pangasius AgriSchool, we actually teach a little short session on actually doing research design and experimental design, and it's focused on helping the feed companies to set up experiments that actually give results that you can say yes or no. Quite often, if we don't know what we're doing, we make experiments and in the end we can't tell anything. I think that the feed companies really have to increase their knowledge and their development, and in the end that's what's going to convince the customers. We can go to the customers and say, what are your problems? What do you need help with? What about your survival? What about the stress levels? And this gives us an idea about, as a feed company, what area might we be able to develop some functional feeds that the customers might be happy to use. Okay, so it's somebody has to start somewhere, and I think that it's really up to the feed companies to do it, and then not assume that I can't do it because I don't have a market. If you have that attitude, you'll never progress at all. You need to be willing to trust the outcome that you're going to get, that you can spend a little R&D money and make a product that customers will be willing to buy if you prove it to them, right? That's the important thing.
Agree. So feed millers must be proactive. Don't be in the game of chicken and egg. Great. Thank you very much for your explanation, Dr. Wilson.
Okay, well, that's my perspective. If you were to talk to 10 other nutritionists, they would give you something else. But having a lot of experience here in Asia, I really think that feed additives could benefit us a lot, especially when we're trying to reduce fish meal and make sustainable feeds. Quite often we need these functional feed ingredients and functional feed additives to keep the performance of our feed. Because when we take things like fish meal out, we remove a lot of special nutrients, and sometimes those functional feed ingredients and functional feed additives put that performance back.
So everyone, I want to inform that Progressus Asia will be conducting the 2025 Aqua Nutrition AgriSchool from 15 to 18 July 2025 in Bangkok, Thailand. And functional aqua feed will be one of the topics discussed. So click www.progressus.asia for more information and to register. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this discussion about functional aqua feed.